Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And a very warm welcome to today's discussion of how Southeast Asia sees China, based on this excellent new report that we have by our fellow here at the Centre for China Analysis, Kevin Lee. You can find the report on the CCA main website and also on the Global Public Opinion on China Analysis section. My name is Andrew Chubb. I'm a fellow in Chinese foreign policy and national security at the Centre for China Analysis at the Asia Society. And I look after the Global Public Opinion on China project, which aggregates and analyses survey results from around the world on China. Also with us today for the discussion are two outstanding experts on the region and China's role within it. We have Sharon Seah from the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, where she's Principal Fellow and the Coordinator for Climate Change in Southeast Asia. It's also, of course, the home of the excellent State of the Region survey of strategic elites across the 11 ASEAN countries. And Sharon previously spent 15 years in Singapore's foreign ministry, including with diplomatic postings to the embassy in Thailand and in the National Environment Agency of Singapore. And she's worked broadly across most of the big issues facing the region: climate change, the role of ASEAN, the international law of the sea, and she was the Associate Director at the Centre for International Law at Singapore's National University. We're also very lucky to have with us Andreyka Natalegawa, who's an Associate Fellow in the Southeast Asia Program at CSIS in Washington, D.C., and who's done some really great work with Greg Polling on views of China and the United States around Southeast Asia across both the elite and popular levels. Andreyka's a member of the Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program and previously served as a Bunker Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown. So I want to jump into the discussion by, first of all, asking Kevin to share with us what really motivated this paper. And maybe you can also explain this idea of swing states that really anchors the analysis and where you've directed the attention. And if you like, also share a couple of your top findings from the paper.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew, for convening this very timely panel. And it's such a privilege to be able to share this stage with Sharon and Andreyka. How we started the paper was really because, Andrew, you have this excellent data set, right? And it's a broad-based data sets with the time span of over 2 decades. But I also think it's just such an important geopolitical point in time where there's so much changes going on to how both China and the world, the US and the world, are being perceived, are being received. How are countries engaging China? How are the citizens at the average daily level are perceiving the influence, the goods and services, the investments coming out of China? So I thought that not just going to take a regional pulse on Chinese on opinion on China, but also trying to disaggregate it to the level that you can see some degrees of country level trends. Now, the swing state idea is for sure not foreign to the region, Southeast Asia itself. You know, countries like Indonesia has indeed been practicing the principle in foreign policy of what's called bebas aktif, which is free and active, stemming, from the initial days of independence and through the Cold War and into the days today. A variety, quite a number of countries in Southeast Asia have been practicing what's called, hedging, which is attempting to not choose a side between two or more great powers and attempting to maximize its own interest, given the amount of options that are being presented at the table. So here we've taken 6 countries out of Southeast Asia, out of a total of 11. These are namely the Philippines, Vietnam. These are Thailand and Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia. And take a look at how opinions have changed over the past 2 decades with regards to China. And there are kind of 3, I'll quickly share 2 or 3 findings that we found was very interesting based on the data that we have available. To begin, general sentiment towards China has in general been net positive over the past 2 decades, but it's been a downward trend. Based on our methodology and looking at it via each decade, the 2000s began with an average of about plus 33. So you can think of that as sort of what's called net favorability or net approval rating. That number went down to 26 in the 2010s. And then in the 2020s, that number has been around 19.8 or 20. So there is a direction in terms of where the opinions are traveling. At the same time, though, if you look at these 6 countries, they don't necessarily move all together. There are 3 distinct patterns that arises. So at the frontline states, the maritime frontline states, where countries have actually had a direct sovereign confrontation with China, such as in the South China Sea. So in the Philippines and Vietnam, we've observed public opinion drops that are rather sharp and rather durable. In states where there is a tension around South China Sea, but where such tension is managed. So in Malaysia, in the case of Malaysia and Indonesia, opinions did fluctuate, but it didn't rupture. And in Thailand and Singapore, where they do not have a direct sovereign confrontation nor tension with China, attitude seems to be more so stable and potentially driven by other factors, including economic linkages, including socio-cultural connections. So the third point that I would come to is that as a bloc, you see a sort of a trend going towards still positive but eroding, but individually at a country level, these are really shaped by influences including economic exposure, sovereignty pressure, plus the way how the elites or the officials are framing such event and giving that sort of extra layer of interpretation before the news or the impact of it arrives at the general public level. So Andrew, I'm going to stop there and very much looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Kevin. And before we get into some of the details, some of the key countries and some of the themes of interest that emerge from this, I'd very much like to hear from Sharon and Andreyka, just your general key takeaways, something that may have surprised you in Kevin's report, and perhaps even because we're talking about public opinion surveys here, so we've always got to maintain a sort of critical disposition in which we entertain the possibility that it is an accurate reflection of public opinion in that country, but also the possibility there's always errors. There's measurement errors, there's badly designed questions, there's all manner of issues with public opinion surveys, which we need to keep in mind. So is there anything, any particular data point that actually jumped out at you as being something you were skeptical of among these survey results? Start with you, Sharon.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me. It's really interesting reading the report, Kevin. Congratulations on a great report. And what really struck me was that the time series data that you have from, I believe it's 2002 to 2024, sort of confirms what we observe on the ground. So in that sense, it's not really surprising that the kind of net positive has been on a downward trend. But in the Trump 2.0 administration, which we're coming almost to a 2-year mark, that seems to have changed in recent surveys. And I think we were just privately discussing on email about the Pew Research data that's just come out maybe 2 or 3 days ago. So I think that probably will make it into your next GPOC 2.0 data set. And I think that will also, sort of come through. The thing that really struck me was how the report didn't go into the other aspects of the people-to-people relations that, between Southeast Asia and China, and how that has been sort of been cultivated over the years. Particularly, I was struck by this the fourth element that Kevin talked about, the domestic framing of the engagement by the political authorities. And what I thought about was, what about the media and what about the social media influence? Because in Southeast Asia, we are really coming across so many instances and incidents of falsehoods and narratives circulating around societies in countries. And for instance, Singapore just recently found a deliberate disinformation campaign that's targeted at the Indians in Singapore. And for the first time, Singapore actually named the country, and it's China. So these sorts of incidences have been happening more frequently now in Southeast Asia. So I think that would be something that, I feel maybe more analysis can go into that.
Thanks, Sharon. How about you, Andreyka?
Thank you. And congratulations, Kevin, Andrew, the Asia Society team. I think this is a fantastic resource. I think the more information we have in terms of how countries in the region are viewing China, the United States, and other partners, I think the better. So really looking forward to making use of this tool in my work. But as I was looking through the data, I think a couple key trends jumped out at me. I think first off, I think it's clear that there's no real sort of one-size-fits-all approach to China in the region. And as much as we talk about Southeast Asia and ASEAN as being sort of these coherent and cohesive political units, it's clear that their constituent parts have very different relationships with China and very different perspectives of China. And so I think that's something that we always have to bake in and factor into our research work and into our policy making, is understanding the sort of differentials there that exist between countries. I'd also note that I think it's very interesting that there doesn't seem to be necessarily a relationship between things like regime type and perspectives of China. When you look at the framing, sort of the three-tiered framing that you've posited in this report, regime type doesn't necessarily seem to be common across the board there, and I think that's always interesting to look at. One thing that I'm particularly interested in as it relates to any of the sort of public opinion projects that folks have put out over the past few years has been this question of, what is it that drives change? What are the sort of key signposts and markers that shift opinion toward China or the United States or other partners? And to me, I think 2020 being one of the really clear moments, sort of inflection points in Southeast Asian perspectives of China, I think is coheres with, I think, narratives that we've heard around things like wolf warrior diplomacy, as well as China's aggression in the context of the South China Sea and other areas like that. And so, I think, what we'll be looking forward to sort of moving forward is seeing this post, 2025 data. That's something that I think we're hoping to look at quite closely. But happy to talk about sort of more country level detail in the discussion. But congratulations again.
Thanks. And that's actually a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask you, Andreyka, about Indonesia in particular. Obviously, a country that you're very familiar with. To what extent do you think the South China Sea or the North Natuna Sea disputes between Indonesia and China actually shape Indonesian views of China? Obviously, the views of China in general are quite positive in Indonesia, according to the data, and that includes the data that Sharon mentioned that just released by Pew. But Kevin's paper actually does show a pretty clear discontinuity from around about 2017, which happens to be when the North Natuna Sea name was introduced. It's also the year after things really blew up on a few occasions in that area with the Chinese Coast Guard and the Indonesian Coast Guard coming into various confrontations. And Indonesia is also a very young society. So how popular is China among the Indonesian youth? Is that possibly part of what's propping up China's image?
Yeah, thank you, and happy to dive into Indonesia specifically. I think the 2017 sort of inflection point is really interesting because, as you note, it's around this time when we see increased tension between China and Indonesia in the context of the North Natuna Sea. Folks might remember sort of around this time photos of then President Jokowi sort of on Navy ships out in the waters of the North Natuna Sea, and so there's a very prominent sort of coordinated media campaign to elevate the issue in a really public way that I think was quite unprecedented for Indonesia. What I would draw out here and sort of looking at this particular disjunction and the drop in public opinion around this time. So I went back into the data set just because I was curious sort of what that data point was and when it came from. And as I understand it, so there's one sort of particular data point coming from a BBC survey that had a very significant drop in favorability. That data point, as far as I could tell, was from around March of 2017, so predating sort of the announcement of the change in the name of the North Natuna Sea. And so, what I think is interesting here is this interplay between opinion polling as a sort of lagging or leading indicator. Right? Does public opinion polling show us the results of government policy, or does it precipitate government policy? And I think when you look at Indonesia in particular, under the Jokowi administration, this was an administration that I think was particularly attuned to public opinion and was particularly focused on sort of the results of surveys, opinion analysis, and things like that helped inform and shape policy. And so in some ways, I think the shift that we saw in Indonesia's outlook related to the South China Sea and the North Natuna Sea, in some ways was the result, I think, of a shift in public opinion. And so I think that's just one thing that I would say in terms of how to better understand that 2017 data. In terms of the youth and their overall perspectives toward China, I do think that our sort of analysis here at CSIS has found that, generally speaking, public opinion tends to favor the United States vis-a-vis China on a sort of relative basis, but Indonesian public still experience quite a lot of favorability toward China. Part of this is driven by economic factors, right? China being Indonesia's primary economic partner in terms of trade, in terms of investment, they're also a very significant factor. And in the context of difficult economic circumstances that we've been seeing in Indonesia over the past few years, China's role as an economic partner is a critically important factor in terms of public opinion. This can cut both ways, though, right? Because this economic dependence can be both a positive thing and a negative thing, and can engender anxieties around China's role in the Indonesian economy. And so that's how I'd sort of frame public opinion and maybe even youth opinion, as they're sort of at the forefront of unemployment and other economic risks. One thing I'd also point out, just in terms of geography, Indonesia is a large country, and I think geographic factors also tend to play a role in terms of shaping public opinion toward China. And here, what I'd be curious about, I don't necessarily have this data on hand, but I would be curious about, there's this question of to what extent does proximity toward, say, Chinese sort of economic mega projects shape opinion toward China. And I'm thinking here about, the coal-fired power plants and the smelters that China has operated in the context of Indonesia's nickel industry. How do communities around these sort of facilities feel about China? What role does that play in shaping perspectives? And so there's a lot to dive into. But I'd say in terms of Indonesia's case, it's clear the trend has been negative, but still on the whole positive. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much. Yes, a large and very internally diverse country. So there's a lot to dig into, even with looking at surveys that are specifically focused on Indonesia, I think. There has been some research done on the African continent, looking at how proximity to Chinese projects affects views of China. And long story short, it's very mixed. It's a different story in different countries. So that's well worth investigating in the case of Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. Sharon, I wanted to talk to you and bring Singapore into this conversation as well, because we have seen Singapore public opinion consistently among the most positive towards China, which at some level is somewhat puzzling, given Singapore is a very strong supporter of the UNCLOS-based International Maritime Order, which Indonesia is, of course, as well. We've just passed the 10-year anniversary, of course, of the arbitration case, which I believe both countries came out in support of at the time. And of course, which China has been sort of defying. There's Singapore's defense partnership as well with the United States, and the fact that many of its citizens get their education in the West, which might be expected to lead to some kind of ideological leaning that may be sort of closer to Western countries. So what do we know about why Singaporean public opinion maintains this sort of positive disposition towards China overall?
That's a very interesting question, and one that I try to work out myself as well. But as you know, there are no polls in Singapore taken along ethnic lines, and there's a certain wariness. For instance, when Singapore was thinking about normalizing relations with the PRC, there was a deliberate decision made by LKY at that time to be the last country to normalize relations. I think we did it maybe 3 weeks after Indonesia finally normalized relations with the PRC, because there's this consciousness of the fact that Singapore has a Chinese majority state, didn't want to be too closely affiliated, associated with the PRC. But times have changed, from the Cold War years to now. And what we are seeing on the ground is really a kind of a wave of Chinese soft power, which is something that I think we haven't paid enough attention to. And it's going beyond panda diplomacy. It's actually going through, platforms like TikTok, and there's this whole China maxing trend that's happening amongst the youths of Southeast Asia. And there's this allure of Chinese dramas. I think you might have heard of The Pursuit of Jade. That's like a major blockbuster. I tell you, this is the thing that's going to really turn on Chinese soft power in the coming years. And You should come to Southeast Asia. You'll see the slew of malatang shops. People are eating malatang, and this is something that's quite foreign to many Chinese immigrant families who've come from China for generations ago. And if I could go walk into a metropolitan city, one of the snap polls I like to do is BYD or Tesla, Xiaomi or Apple, and ask people to choose. And I think that's where you get the clearest indication of where they might choose. So these sorts of soft power, I think there's a very good strategy behind this now. So it's moved beyond BRI projects, huge infrastructure. Of course, you cannot definitively point a finger and put a finger on it and say, oh, this is state-led. A lot of it is actually private sector-led. But the fact that they've been coming through and percolating down and coming through to Southeast Asia and gaining ground is something to think about. And I think it's moving, the hearts and minds of the younger people. For instance, my parents' generation, they wouldn't know malatang. It's not something that they normally eat. You would do Chinese Hong Kong dim sum cuisine, or you have steamboats at home, but you don't do malatang. But the younger generation are very familiar with that now. I can't explain this. I think that partly it's the economic exposure that they have, particularly those who work in jobs that require them to communicate with Chinese counterparts. Partly it's also the kind of soft power relations that's happening in the region. And I think the kind of affinity, I'm not too sure as well, because there are no definitive studies pointing to the kind of, ethnic or linguistic or cultural affinity between Singapore and China. So it's very hard to tell. But if we look at Malaysia, for instance, Malaysia is our closest neighbor. And in the Pew polls as well, Malaysia's favorability towards China is also very high. They are a Muslim majority country. And so what explains that as well? I mean, I can't explain that unless a very definitive study is taken. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on Singapore.
Thanks, Sharon. And yeah, it is very interesting that the China maxing phenomenon has sort of washed up on Singaporean shores. It's a very interesting phenomenon and strikes me as being probably related more to the Singaporean population's integration with English language discourse, perhaps more than Chinese language discourse, since China maxing was very much a kind of Western social media phenomenon. I don't know. I don't know if anybody has an update on whether China maxing is sort of still a phenomenon, but it was a few months ago when I checked.
I think it's still a phenomenon. Anecdotally, I was told by a friend recently that Japan is the top travel destination for Singaporeans. Apparently, the Singaporeans have switched and they are all now going to China. I don't know how true that is. I mean, we have to look at the tourism numbers going out from Singapore to China vis-a-vis Singapore to Japan, but apparently it's still it's very much in trend. Yeah.
It's another of those people-to-people factors that we need to take into account. Kevin, I wanted to bring you back and ask, because I think you've done a bit of research on Vietnam over the years, and I was, my example of data points that I was a bit skeptical of in the Vietnamese chart, where in recent years there's, according to the surveys that we've collected, a marked improvement in Vietnamese views of China or sentiments towards China. In fact, it was strong negative results in Vietnam that did a lot to drag down the regional average in the 2010s, particularly after the Hyang Shio 981 oil rig fiasco in 2014. So to what extent do you think, based on your experience and research, do you think this is attributable to real improvement in views of China in Vietnam, or more of a response to, at the elite level, the Vietnamese government signaling to the population that anti-China nationalism isn't as politically welcome as it may have been a few years ago?
Yeah, Andrew. Well, it's, the data itself has its flaws, and it's, a little bit difficult to fully separate the two kind of factors that you just mentioned. But coming out of the data a little bit, I think you've pointed it very, very well that the 2014 subsequent developments, including protests that were kind of took place in Vietnam in response to the summer oil rig standoff, was a low point in China-Vietnam relations. But over the past couple years, it's been a rather resounding, bounce back in terms of where we were back then and where we are today. Taking a look at the 2025 figures, and you'd be pretty astonished, right? Vietnam and China has traded in the year 2025 over $250 billion of goods. That's a 25% year-on-year increase. They've welcomed 5.3 million of Chinese into Vietnam. That is a number that historically would have been comparable to the Chinese tourist populations that are going to Thailand, for example. You have President To Lam, who spent, I don't remember how many hours exactly, but he spent at least like 6, if not 8 hours riding through the high-speed rail of China from the north to the south to signal that perhaps Vietnam could have a chance at developing the equivalent between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And so it does seem to be a more structural reimagination of China from the position of Vietnam. This is also, aided by what seems to be a pretty warm party-to-party relationship, especially at the highest level, potentially with the shared understanding of the world from a domestic stability and sort of like a regime security, like a political security perspective, especially in response to how the shifts that we're seeing around the world quoted by President Xi, that we haven't seen in 100 years. So it's certainly not that Vietnam has chosen to neglect and disregard its strategic partnership with the US, as well as its other partners, but certainly have also made it super clear that Vietnam is pro-Vietnam in this specific era, and that it is prioritizing the economic opportunities and the development opportunities that came partially as an extension of the massive manufacturing powers and the economic engine of China, and to what extent it benefited from the China Plus One business strategies under specifically President Biden's administration that really put Vietnam on the map. I think has a lot to do with its rather pragmatic approach and rather strong economic focus in this specific time of today.
Yeah, and you mentioned the party-to-party relationship. Of course, that really overlays everything in the China-Vietnam relationship. Is as fellow Marxist-Leninist party states, they rely on each other for political security and support, as well as kind of ideological narratives and orthodoxies. And that makes the relationship between elite opinion and public opinion in Vietnam, particularly ambiguous and complex and difficult to understand through opinion polls in particular. But there are many other countries in the region where we may be able to learn a bit more about how those two important circles of opinion relate to each other. So I want to ask our guests, who are both themselves actually experts who've done research on both elite and public opinion in the region, about this question of how elites and citizenries relate when it comes to views of China. Our colleague at CCA, Lizzie Lee, recently co-published a piece with Eric Olander of the China Global South Project in Foreign Affairs that really argues that China's popular consumer products are what drives positive views of the country in many parts of the Global South at the popular level, while elites are often more concerned with macroeconomic issues and economic security, Chinese overcapacity, and the like. So I guess ISEAS and CSIS have both worked on elite surveys around the region. So, I mean, the basic question is, how aligned do you think the public's views are with those of elites in the countries that either you think matter the most or which you're most familiar with? Because there's a range of different issues where they may come together or they may diverge. Andreyka, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So in the context of CSIS's work over the past few years, we've looked at both public and elite opinion polling of Southeast Asians and looking at their perspectives towards China and the United States. Generally, our finding is that public and elite opinion in most Southeast Asian countries tend to track in similar directions in terms of their feelings toward China, in terms of whether positive or negative. Magnitude might be different. It may be that elites are more favorable than the public is, but they're still trending in the same direction. One country that I think we've seen some level of disjunction between public and elite opinion has often been Singapore, actually, where in some of our research work, we've found that elites tend to be more favorable to the United States than China, whereas it's sort of the opposite, I think, among parts of the public. But that's sort of just one example of where we've seen some disjunction. But to this point about consumer goods, I think it's an interesting picture, right? And I think that they are a source of positive sentiment across the board, sort of generally speaking. I do think there's opportunities for tension, however, in the context of economic displacement. Sort of if these public sort of consumer products that are coming in from China are displacing or otherwise disrupting countries' desire or ability to climb up the value chain and become producers of these goods themselves. And so I think that's one area of of potential friction in that context. One thing I'd also just throw out there, that the China maxing conversation earlier had me thinking about other vectors of sort of public opinion in the region. And this is just a very odd sort of stray thought, but gaming and sort of the internet being an additional source that I don't think that we think about enough, especially in the context of shaping youth perceptions. And given China's increased role in this industry in the region, I think that's something that will really shape perceptions among the young Southeast Asians in years to come.
And China's number one for esports.
So please go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually the gap between the public and the elites in Singapore, I at least from this year's 2026 State of Southeast Asia survey, seems to be narrowing. Because for the first time in that binary question that we're often reported on, if forced to choose, which one would you choose, China or the US? And for the first time for Singapore, it's chosen China. And the support from the elites from Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei in particular is very high. So I think in terms of the alignment between the elites and the public opinion polls, the kind of trends that you may be seeing in the next GPOC 2.0, you'll be narrowing and won't be as obvious as before. And one of the countries that's most consistent to me is actually Vietnam, between elites and the public in their support for the US. So, despite everything, they seem to be voting with the same mind. Yeah, for the Vietnamese.
Or at least answering surveys with the same mind.
Yeah, at least answering surveys. And on that point about consumer goods, for Southeast Asia, they're also looking for opportunities, particularly from where I'm perched, looking at climate transition. China certainly is a big leader in that. They have been creating an entire ecosystem, building, the EV manufacturing base, wind turbines, solar panels, battery energy storage systems, everything and anything that they can think of for climate transition. And in a way, Southeast Asia is a beneficiary as well, because when you are thinking about trying to transition yourself or your country out, you want to buy the most cost-effective technologies that can help you ramp up the adoption of renewable energy. And when you're confronted with that choice, between German-made, American-made, or China-made, the choice is quite clear, because the price competitiveness for Chinese-made technology and products, it just can't be beat. So for the Southeast Asians, they are very pragmatic. They will go for that. And then the longer term consideration for the elites will be, can we take part in this green growth opportunity, where you see China progressing and being able to harness all of these opportunities. The Southeast Asian countries themselves too would like to have a chance to maybe enter into joint ventures with Chinese companies to start manufacturing some of these, or at least to be able to take part in the technology transfers of knowledge and so on. So there are two layers to it. I think for the consumers, it is the immediate benefit of gaining that product at a competitive price. But for the elites, it's thinking about the future opportunities.
I would maybe even just kind of go off of that and say, Sharon, I think there are kind of countries in Southeast Asia that already have an industrial base that is potentially at the risk of being displaced with what some would call the influx of Chinese surplus, or the influx of Chinese clean energy overcapacity. And there are a set of countries that doesn't have that industrial base, but is still faced with the same energy security crisis that has, only been exacerbated since Hormuz. And those are the ones that are going to be the first that are jumping at taking a look at how can we maximize trade with China to bring as much as clean energy goods into our country that can satisfy all the clean energy security, sustainability, and hopefully affordability demands. But I think for some Southeast Asian countries that are in the former camp, which might include Malaysia, might include Indonesia, to a certain extent, Singapore as well, is what kind of arrangements then, like you said, JVs or some kind of technology transfer kind of agreements to preserve a certain amount of local manufacturing capability, whether it's from your incumbents or whether it is in a cooperative relationship with the newcomers, including the Chinese manufacturing, and striking that balance with open trade to the degree that you can also build up your clean energy generation capacity as your energy demand arises. So I thought that's actually one of the things that the CCA is looking at, and I think there's definitely a big question around that, which is how do you maximize clean energy without minimizing your own sovereignty and, of course, economic performance. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Kevin. And we have about 15 minutes left. So I just want to pause before I move on to my last two burning questions for our guests and let the audience know that the Q&A is now open. So if you have questions for Kevin and our guests, please put your questions in the Q&A, which is located, I think, to the right of the share button in your Zoom platform. And we will get to as many of the questions as we can in the next quarter of an hour or so. Next burning question from me, though, and this is a bit of a pet theme of mine since I've been studying public opinion on China through this global public opinion project, is the relationship between people's images of China and the United States. So we often hear, particularly since last year, that China's image has been significantly boosted by Trump making the US look bad. And, certainly the data bear this out in the Western world. And I think maybe China maxing is even part of that story. There's an element of in China maxing in which it's kind of anywhere but the United States, and a kind of escapism, particularly amongst the US youth that originally drove it. But actually, the data that I've seen suggests that this is more of a developed world thing. The views of the United States have certainly crashed around the world since 2025. But for many global South countries, I think the views of China have actually been pretty flat. So the latest Pew data did show Indonesia and Malaysia to be exceptions to that. So the views of China have gone up by about 5 to 10%, I think, from memory in Indonesia and Malaysia. But then in Thailand, we've seen a very big drop that would actually offset that on an aggregate level. I think it's gone down about 10 points in Thailand. And across the African continent, people very often seem to have a positive view of both the United States and China. So they're not that closely related. So what do you think in this particular part of the world? How closely related are people's images of China to their images of the United States?
I think first thing, the global south is not a homogeneous block. Nominally, Singapore sees itself as part of the global south as well, right? Because we came from that history of decolonization and shared experiences with our neighbors. But, developmentally, Singapore's very, very advanced. And so even within Southeast Asia as a subset of the global south, I think there are variances and nuances within that grouping as well. And this year in the State of Southeast Asia 2026 survey, to our great surprise, when we asked the respondents what are the top 3 geopolitical concerns for your government in your country, the top one is US leadership under President Trump at 51.9%. It overtook concerns over aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, which obviously by that term, it means that aggressive behavior is being caused by a certain party in that part of the world. And so that's a really surprising finding for us, that Washington's image has really gone all the way down, to the extent that now the elites in Southeast Asia think that the leadership, US leadership, is going to cause problems for its government. But when we ask another question about China as a strategic leader of the global South, here the picture is a little bit muddled, because although about 42% of the respondents say they believe in China's ability to lead the global South, actually nearly 60% have chosen to say no comment, or that they were unsure. So the level of skepticism towards China as a global South leader is still fairly high. I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the 42% who say very confident China is going to lead us well, but rather it is the silent fence sitters, the 30% who says, I have no comment because I want to watch and wait and see how China is going to lead the global South. And the other 30% who says, I have little or no confidence in China's ability to lead. So I think this picture is going to be a kind of, evolving picture, and you have to tune back in later to see actually how different parts of the global South view China's leadership.
Indeed. And just because your view of the United States declines doesn't necessarily mean your view of China should improve. That can be the case, as we've seen in some countries, but it doesn't necessarily follow logically. What about Indonesia, Andreyka, and other countries that you've been looking at? How closely related are the two?
Yeah, I've been sort of mulling on this answer. I think it is linked and it isn't linked, right? And I say it is linked in the sense that I think, to Sharon's point about sort of respondents to the ISEAS survey identifying shifts in U.S. Leadership in the region as being a particular factor that they think about. It's impossible to disentangle perspectives toward China from, I think, broader headlines that we see related to U.S. leadership in the region. I think that it's sort of peak news saturation, information saturation, right? And so, when you're asking a survey respondent to think about their views on China, almost inherently the framing tends to be one of sort of U.S.-China competition, sort of great power competition. And so it's hard to disentangle that. And that's certainly what we've seen, I think, in some of our surveys where, and some of our analysis where, shifts in perception toward the United States in turn shift perception of China, of Russia, and of other powers. And in the Indonesia example, post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you actually saw a fair amount of support for Russia among the general public. And part of this is because of genuine sort of public positive sentiment toward Russia. But part of this is also because of, I think, a very strong strain of anti-Western sentiment among the general public. And part of this is rooted in sort of the post Iraq War, Afghanistan War, sort of United States misadventures in the Middle East in the 2000s, and sort of there being a legacy, I think, of skepticism of the United States in Indonesia. But you can see how views of the West in turn shape views of other sort of centers of power, whether it be China or Russia. Having said that, I do think that it would be a mistake to overdetermine the views of the United States vis-a-vis views of China. And of course, Southeast Asian countries have agency, and how they interact with China, irrespective of the relationship with the United States, is something that we should be watching and something we should better understand. And it would be a mistake to sort of make it all about Washington, right? Having said that, I do think that something we're looking at sort of post 2025 onward is the emergence of other centers of power, think places like Europe and the role of the European Union. So to this point about is the United States' losses China's gain? In some cases, yes, but China is not the only sort of player in this space, and so the United States' loss might be the EU's gain. It might be the Middle East's gain now, and so there's a whole web of players that we need to better understand here.
Great point. Not only is it potentially not a zero-sum game, the soft power competition, but it's also not a two-player game. Kevin, did you have anything to add on that?
I don't strictly from a research perspective, but what I often find interesting whenever I travel through Greater China, so namely Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, as well as various parts of Southeast Asia, and speak to people who are Chinese descent. They tend not to have a strong judgment on China, but tend to they tend to care less about the analytics of it all. But then bring in this dimension of what their experience is, whether it is through their own family experience, whether it is through their own family stories, or through whether they found a way to engage, do business, send their kids, or have been traveling more and more so to China. So I think to Sharon's point with regards to this missing piece of human-to-human, cultural, people-to-people exchange, I think that undercurrent is very much there and relevant, but there hasn't really been a channel to surface what all of that emotions and experiences and engagements has been. And I think that is one of the areas where we can potentially look at further is how does that stories, right? We talked a little bit about the role of ethnicities. We haven't quite talked about religion, but ethnicities certainly in Southeast Asia. If we just can try to disaggregate results based on ethnic responses, same as how we discussed various generations as well, so age groups, I think we could find really interesting results coming out of there.
Thanks very much. And we have some interesting questions in the chat. So what I think I'm going to do is summarize. I think we've got three in particular that take the conversation in some different directions. So I might put them all on the table, and we'll go around and sit, and you can choose to bite off whichever question suits you. First of all, the future outlook, given that China is the largest trading partner and investor in all ASEAN countries except perhaps Timor-Leste, and I think maybe actually very much Timor-Leste as well. Is that likely to drive perceptions of China up or down over time across the region? So that's the first question from Noel. Second question, very interesting, which we haven't talked about yet, is China's role and stance that it's taken towards the Thai-Cambodian border conflict. So has that enhanced or affected in any way China's standing in the region, in particular, perhaps in Thailand? Or does the economic reliance on China actually overcome any sort of effects that might arise from China's stance on the Thai-Cambodian conflict? And then thirdly, Filipino public opinion. So obviously, the Philippines has been the target of most of China's assertive and aggressive actions in the South China Sea in recent years. But also, it's also a destination for Chinese consumer goods. It's plugged into that English language discourse around China maxing. It gets Chinese dramas. So are we seeing a sort of offsetting of the maritime tensions by those softer factors? Why don't we go around the table? I'll start with Andreyka.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll tackle sort of the trade and sort of economic question first. It's interesting. We've recently done a piece of work at CSIS called the Global Alignment Index, where we looked at relative U.S.-China alignment in Southeast Asian countries and in BRICS member states. And we found that we looked at trade and investment over time as a proportion of a country's overall trade and investment balance globally. And China, the two, I think, key trends that emerged in our research work was one, China has emerged as the primary economic partner for most of the region, and that trend has increased over time. But the second part of that being that hasn't necessarily led to a discernible shift in terms of U.S.-China alignment. And so from what we've seen, at least, that economic relationship and sort of the broadening of that aperture hasn't necessarily led to a substantial positive shift in views toward China. So I'll leave it at that for that question. For the question on the Philippines specifically, and what we can expect in terms of public perceptions of China, I think in some ways we're at a similar inflection point that we saw sort of at the close of the Duterte administration, nearly 7 sort of years ago, where I think the Duterte administration adopted a largely conciliatory attitude and posture toward China, but it was clear sort of by the end of the Duterte presidency that approach didn't necessarily bear fruit. China and the Philippines were still experiencing tensions in the context of the South China Sea. The economic benefits that the Duterte administration sought to capture didn't materialize. And so I think there was a fair amount of frustration within the broader public regarding sort of what seemed to be a shift in the government's approach, but then a failure to really reap the benefits of that. What I think we might be seeing now is almost the inverse of that, where the Marcos administration has clearly aligned with the United States, has taken a much more sort of proactive posture in the South China Sea and has done a lot in terms of publicizing what's happening there. But the question here is, has this approach borne fruit? And is the Philippines seeing the benefit of this approach? And part of this is economic, and I think speaks to the importance of the U.S.-Philippines economic relationship and the importance of shoring up that part of the alliance. But it's certainly something that we'll be looking at as we're heading into election season in the Philippines.
Thanks, Andreyka. Sharon?
To Noel's question, all is well until it is not well. And the trade with China is a double-edged sword, right? I think many countries have experienced how China can use economic pressures and trade tools to place pressures on countries. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think it's something that countries, when they trade with China, there's that part wariness. So again, back to the survey that my institute does, they acknowledge that China is the biggest and most important economic influence in the region. But at the same time, there are high levels of worry. Why is that so? Because they are worried of being punished or of being sanctioned, for certain decisions taken or for certain positions taken where it may cross China's unspoken red lines. So some of these things, just come out of the blue. So for instance, in the case of the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award, it's widely believed that Singapore's Terex incident may be linked to Singapore's strong support for UNCLOS in that case. And then on the question about China balancing its own relationship, I don't think China really needs to do anything. The more hardworking partners of the relationship is actually Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asian countries are like, the girlfriend who has to put in more effort, right, to sort of manage the relationship, make sure you don't trigger some reaction, and that's the reality. We live in a region where China is in the region. And so in that sense, we have to be a lot more careful in managing the relationship, whereas America is not in the region. You're far away. You're separated by the Pacific Ocean. So not that we don't pay attention. We would love to have that balance of power in the region. But, in terms of managing, I think I don't really think China thinks very carefully about it. I think China does manage its relationship with maybe the Mekong countries where there's this extension of the overland connection. So they do play a more active role, like the example that is cited by the person who asked the question about Thailand and Cambodia. They also play a little bit more active role in the Myanmar conflict. And perhaps with the tension states, as mentioned, as picked up by Kevin in his paper, right, with Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, maybe not so. Maybe those relationships, they look more towards the economic aspects of that relationship. To the question on the Philippines, I don't know. I'll be really curious if someone can do a young person or youth survey. To answer that question. Thanks.
There is indeed plenty to follow up. So I want to thank again our guests for joining us today, and I hope we'll be able to have you back to discuss the next report and also to hear more about your own research on these very important and evolving and complex topics. So once again, thank you to all of our guests, and I highly recommend everybody to go to the Center for China Analysis website to take a look at Kevin's paper, where you can engage with these various arguments as well. Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.